They wanted you to believe the whole time that this disease was far more lethal than it really was. To engage in draconian measures, the bankrupting of entire swaths of American society, the shutting down of schools, spiking in suicide rates, people failing, kids failing their standardized testing now because they haven't been in school for a year. For what? A media fairy tale based on lethality numbers that weren't even remotely close to accurate. You know, none of this would be allowed to happen, this perpetual gaslighting campaign where liberals don't live by their own edicts. You know, how dare conservatives call out voter fraud? Maybe because you set up the conditions for voter fraud and everything else they don't live by, which I discussed in the beginning of the show. But none of this would be allowed to happen without a sycophantic group of acolytes in the media surgically attaching their lips to the asses of the media around the country. Here's another one on COVID. A very serious, deadly virus, no doubt. But very serious and very deadly for very specific groups of people. People with my disease, lymphoma. I'm high risk now. People with diabetes, respiratory conditions, people who are elderly. Very serious. But ladies and gentlemen, the data, the actual data, pointing to the lethality of that for young and healthy people, says the opposite. Let me go to this piece by Holman Jenkins. It's a good one. They talk about how the media spun this, and I believe did it to attack the president and to use it as a political weapon rather than to give you accurate, legitimate medical information. The piece by Holman Jenkins is called "COVID Was Hiding Among Colds and Flus." Too much focus on Washington and magic fixes has impeded grassroots adaptation. First, he talks about this very, very interesting point. And I think it points out to the absolutely hysterical red line anxiety campaign the media wanted you, instilled in you, to use it as a political weapon against the president rather than getting you accurate data to live your lives and run your business. The first part of this screenshot, they talk about how despite an outrageous number of COVID tests, 100+ million, we've only found a very small percentage of actual COVID positives. Check this out. I'm going to explain to you why this matters in a minute. He says, quote, "An American adult typically suffers for 2 colds a year, while school-aged children may suffer 10 or more, and 20 million of us get the flu. A conservative estimate then is that 13 million Americans every day suffer from something not readily distinguishable from a mild cold, never mind asymptomatic COVID. This perhaps, listen, explains why, despite conducting 186 million COVID tests since the plague arrived, we found only 12.7 million cases. Most who have COVID aren't getting tested. And among those seeking tests, the large majority are suffering from something that isn't COVID." It's just happened to me with my daughter. We had to send my daughter for a test because I'm high risk. Came up negative. You know what my daughter had? A cold. My wife had it too. So part one of this, ladies and gentlemen, clearly people showing up thinking they have COVID for these tests in overwhelming numbers do not have COVID. Those are just, I know we don't do facts. I know, the YouTube tech tyrants, that's why I'm on Rumble, whatever, ban this show or take it down because facts and stuff doesn't comport with the leftist lunatics at YouTube. That's okay. I don't really care. Strike me down. We only become stronger. Obi-Wan Kenobi style. But those are just facts. 186 million tests. Probably 140, 150 million of those people went because they thought they had something. Some were probably just tests done in some prophylactic manner because they had a trip somewhere or something. But less than 10% of those actually had COVID. They probably had a cold. Meaning, overwhelming numbers of people have COVID, are not getting tested because they didn't show up for the COVID test. Because only a small number of people showed up for the COVID test had COVID. Meaning what? That most of the people who have it, many of them, I shouldn't say most, precision matters, many people who have it are probably asymptomatic and don't even know. What does that mean? Because they're not the people showing up for the tests. Let's go to part 2, and I'm going to tell you what that likely means. Jenkins has been writing about this for a long time. He says it means a disease that infects 10 million people and kills 2.5% will kill the same number as a disease that infects 100 million people and kills 0.25%. But they need to be approached differently. The latter is what we've been facing. The former is the picture we've been consistently painting for the public with our obsession with, quote, confirmed cases. What is he saying, folks? What he's saying is that given that a large number of COVID cases based on the testing data, are not in fact infected with COVID, that given the infectious level of the virus, that most people infected with COVID are in fact so asymptomatic, they don't even know and don't get tested. Meaning what? That a lot more people probably have COVID than the confirmed cases indicate. You may say, how's that a positive? It's not. But it does mean this, that if 5 or 10 times the number of people have COVID as confirmed cases in the United States, that the virus is not nearly as lethal as we've been told. Because as he gives a simple ratio, if confirmed cases were 100 and 25 people died, folks, you'd be like, my gosh, that's a lethal disease. 25 people died. But that's confirmed cases. What if 1 million people had COVID and 25 people died? All of a sudden, ladies and gentlemen, it's a far less lethal disease, is it not? Why am I so furious about this? Because what did we tell you from day one with COVID when this show was doing the facts? It was safe to reopen schools. When this show was talking about R-naughts and lethalities, infection levels and the lethality of the virus, what were we saying? We were saying that before we induce draconian measures like sending the alcohol police into a bar to find people, we should maybe understand how lethal the virus is and how infectious it is first. Now, what do we know? We know it's likely highly infectious, very dangerous to at-risk groups, but probably not very dangerous at all to people who are not in high-risk groups and who are young and healthy. All of that was thrown out the window. Tucker covered this last night, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry to tell you, but you are living through one of the most disturbing periods of media malfeasance we have seen in modern American history, and that's saying a lot for the garbage media we have in this country. They wanted you to believe the whole time that this disease was far more lethal than it really was. To engage in draconian measures, the bankrupting of entire swaths of American society, the shutting down of schools, spiking in suicide rates, people failing, kids failing their standardized testing now because they haven't been in school for a year. For what? A media fairy tale based on lethality numbers that weren't even remotely close to accurate.
You just heard Dan Bongino.